Hey guys, this is Adam, and did you know that you can use a single ARM template to create multiple instances of your resources or create multiple properties on those resources? I'm gonna show you all of that in today's episode. Stay tuned. One of the coolest features for ARM templates are copy elements. They are used to multiply JSON blocks within your ARM templates, and they can be applied to pretty much anything, starting from resources through properties, variables, and even outputs. And they are an iterative approach to create multiple instances of those blocks. So what scenarios they are used for? Well, pretty much anything whenever you want to create multiple instances of the same resource, or you want to create anything that works on an array. So those can be parameters, variables, returning array outputs in a section, or creating multiple properties on some sort of resource, like network security groups or application settings for the web application. How do they work? Well, they're fairly simple when it comes to syntax. You have 4 properties: name and account, those are the mandatory properties, and a mode and a batch size. Name is just the name for your current iteration. For instance, if you're copying storage accounts, this can be called storage copy. The count is how many iterations you're redoing. If you want to create 5 storage accounts, then the count would be 5. With mode, you can specify whenever you want to deploy your resources serially or in parallel. By default, it's parallel. But if you want, you can specify this mode to be serial, in which case you can specify how many resources in a batch should Resource Manager provision before moving on. If you type 1, this will be a sequential deployment for every storage account. There's very few scenarios where you want to deploy serially, so in most cases just leave those 2 out of your copy loops, because they are optional. And if you want to create dependency on this loop and wait for all the deployments to be finished, simply type the name of the loop in the depends on section. So let's go into a real example. If you're deploying a storage account called my account, you can add a copy element to your template, which will copy everything outside of this element as many times as it's specified in account. In this case, 3 times, but what you can quickly notice is that for all the cases, it uses the same name. And if you can imagine, if you're gonna start deploying this ARM template, it's gonna fail, because you cannot deploy 3 storage accounts using the same name. So what you can do, and you should do, is use a copy index function. This function returns a current number of the iterations starting from 0. That means instead of typing a static name for your storage account, you can use this function in a name section and concatenate your name with the copy index. This expression will be evaluated for every iteration of this copy loop, which will result in appending the suffix on your storage account names. In this case, it's gonna be my account 0, 1, and 2. Copy index is fairly straightforward function, but it's your also main way of iterating through resources in ARM. So if your block looks like this, if you're copying any kind of resource, you provide the name and the count, and then you can use the copy index to provide additional logic for other properties. It doesn't have to be name, it can be any property on that resource. Result for this iteration is fairly simple. Because the count is 5, we're gonna get 5 storage accounts, iterating from 0 to 4. Copy index function also allows you to pass a parameter. This parameter is the name of the copy loop that you're currently using, and this is highly recommended to do so for every copy index that you can, to avoid ambiguity in case you're doing more copies in your templates. Additionally, what you can do is you can pass one more parameter to the copy index, which is called offset. With an offset parameter, you can specify from which number should the iteration start from. So you can pass, for instance, 10, therefore your accounts will start from 10, ranging to 14 for this particular example. You can also use copy elements to copy variables and properties. One thing to note is that in this case there's quite a few differences between copying of the properties and variables versus copying of the resources. In resources you copy the outer element, in properties and variables you copy the inner element supplied by the input property of that copy block. And this copy always returns an array, in this case supplying the value from the input property. Additionally, what you should note here is that the name of the loop becomes the name of the property after returning, so it's a little bit different than previously. And lastly, it's just a syntax note. When specifying the block for the copy, it's an object within an array, but it always returns an array, so remember about it. So let's grab an example. So if you have a variable and a copy element within that variable, and you specify the name string array count of 3 and concatenate the name of the item with the copy index. What this will return is a string array. As I said, the name of the loop becomes the name of the property, in which case creates a variable called string array with 3 items because the count was 3, ranging from 0 to 2, because we concatenated the copy index with the item name. And you can use the same approach for the properties on the resources. So for instance, for the app settings on an application, you can create a copy element, call it app settings, count of 3, and then provide an object instead of the string. So the input that you provide for the copy element doesn't have to be a simple string, it can be an object as well. In this case, we are creating app settings property, 3 objects within it, with the name and the value properties, and concatenating the settings and the value with the copy index. As you see, it's fairly simple, and you can create multiple properties on your resources using the copy elements. Lastly, you can use copy elements with an output section of your ARM template, in which case there are a few marginal differences. You still copy the inner property of the copy block, and it still returns an array with the values. But the difference is, first of all, you don't specify the array on the copy element, it's just an object. And second of all, you don't specify the loop name. And because you don't have a name, you don't use a reference within the copy index. But I think it's gonna be easier if I'm gonna just show you an example. So if you have an output and you define a string array as a property of your output, and then within that property you still define the type, which is an array, and you create a copy element. In this case, let's say it has a count of 2, and you concatenate the name with the copy index. As I said, notice there's no name on this copy loop. So the output of this will be a value, and the value will be an array, supplying the item 0 and item 1. And you can notice that the copy index didn't use any reference because the loop didn't have any name. And we don't do that because the property itself already has a string array as a name, because this is the syntax for the output section in ARM templates. And we can actually move on. There are not many watchouts here, but key information that you should always remember is use the loop name for the copy index whenever possible. It's just a good practice. Copy element doesn't also support child resources, so if you need to create a child resource, for instance for storage account, create a storage container, then you need to create it as a top level resource. And if you're changing deployment mode on your templates, be careful when using complete mode, because any resource that is not resolved during the template deployment, including those resource iterations using copy blocks, will be deleted. And lastly, the demos. In the demos, we're gonna practice pretty much everything that I showed you right now. So we're gonna deploy multiple storage accounts, then we're gonna move to parameters, create dependencies between copy blocks and other resources. I'm gonna deploy child resources and do a lot of stuff around variables, outputs, and properties. So let's go to the portal and start deploying resources. And to do that, let's go to Visual Studio Code and create some templates. So create new template, call it arm.json. In which case I'm gonna create a simple storage account. I already have a sample template that I'm gonna use today, and notice that this deploys a storage account and creates a name called storage and random unique string based on my resource group name. And this is pretty much where we start off. So let's multiply the storage account and create multiple instances of it. So let's create a new block called copy. As you see, IntelliSense works with that. It's an object, and within this object we need to specify name. So in our case, I'm gonna call it storage copy. And we also need to specify count. So in this case, I'm just gonna type 3 for a very simple example. If you remember, if I'm gonna start deploying this, I'm gonna get an error because I cannot deploy 3 storage accounts with the same name, because this unique string gives a unique based on a resource group, but for this resource group, it's always gonna be the same. So we also need to use this concat and add the copy index. So let's use the copy index at the very end here, and let's use copy index, and that's it. Let's grab this template and go to the portal, and let's try to deploy that. Let's create new template, build from our own template, paste it in, create new resource group called arm01, hit OK, accept the terms, and hit purchase. Once the deployment is done, notice that we have storage, random unique string 0, 1, 2. So it worked flawlessly. So the next thing we can do is actually parameterize this. So you are not forced to use the static number here. You can actually use parameters. And for instance, you can pass the parameter called storage count. By default, it's gonna be 3. I can change it to, for instance, 7. And instead of the count, I can use expression. So you can actually parameterize this. So parameters and the name of storage count. This will now pass the storage count as the counter for our iterations. And you can simply grab this and go again to the portal and deploy this again. So let's build from the template, create arm02. Let's leave it as 7 and hit purchase. And as you see, deployment finished, and we have 7 storage accounts from 0 to 6. And this is how easy it is to parameterize your template to create multiple instances of the same resource. So let's go into a bit more advanced scenarios. And as a good practice, remember to grab this name of the iteration and use it as a parameter for the copy index. In the second example, instead of passing the counter, we're gonna pass a suffixes that we want to append to the storage name. In which case we cannot pass the parameter because this is an array. So we need to count actually the length of the array that we passed as a parameter. And the parameter is called currently the storages. So right now this will return an array and this will calculate the length, which in this case is 1, 2, 3. And instead of using a copy index to add a number at the end, we're gonna use a copy index as an index of this array. In which case we're gonna type here parameters. I'm just gonna make a space so I get IntelliSense. And the parameters is storages. So this will return an array and we can use a copy index to specify the array index. Let's look at what we just did. We will iterate from 0 to 2 going through the parameters. So grabbing for the first iteration Contoso, for the second Fabricam, and for the third one Demo. So let's grab this template and go to the portal and deploy that. Again, the template deployment, build your own template, save it, create arm03 as a resource group. But notice you can also override this here if you want to. Hit purchase and just wait, but you will very quickly notice that you're gonna get an error. And the error is that the name generated for our iteration is too long because we added storage, random string, and the name. And this is already exceeding the 24 characters length. Remember about it when creating the storage loops and loops in general, that you need to still obey what are the limits for the accounts and other resources when it comes to property names. So let's change this to S, maybe just S, unique string, and then the name. So let's grab it, let's go back to the template, let's close this error, edit template, paste it in, leave everything as previously, and hit purchase. And as you see, after deployment finish, we have Contoso, Demo, and Fabricam as your suffixes for the storage account names. This is how easy it is to pass the parameters, iterate over them, and do dynamic configuration based on that. One of the best examples for doing that is network security groups, where you can pass an array with an objects specifying the configuration settings for network security groups filters. And in this case, let's go into the next demo. In this example, I'm going to refer to the previous example where I'm passing the storage account to specify how many accounts I want to create, and additionally, I'm going to deploy a data factory. So I just copy pasted a very small block creating data factories called dependent data factory using the same resource group location and some default property for the identity. If I want to deploy data factory after the storage accounts, maybe because I will be connecting to those storage accounts, or maybe I want to initialize data factory using the storage account connection strings, then I can do a dependency between the storage copy and this data factory. And to do that, you simply create it depends on section. As previously stated, this is an array, and provide a name. And in this case, it's just the name of the loop. In our case, copy storage. If you grab this template, go to the portal, initialize new deployment. I want to show you what will happen when it comes to resource ordering during the deployment. So let's hit save. Let's create arm04. Let's hit OK, create 3 storage accounts, hit purchase, and just wait. Once the deployment is done, you can either go to the resource group or you can go to the deployment itself. To notice that if you expand on the deployment details, you're gonna get 3 storage accounts deployed first and then data factory, because it was dependent on that. And you can always find that in the template in that this depends on section, And if you go to the resource group, you're gonna find your free storage accounts and the data factory after a while. And it's here. Let's do a demo with child resources now. Let's go to Visual Studio Code, where I already prepared you another template, and let me paste it in. So let's see. In this example, we're deploying a storage account, and we want to deploy containers. So a child resource of a storage account. In this case, we're passing the parameter container count and creating a resource of type Microsoft storage accounts. And this is how it indicates this is a parent resource. Blob services containers. A name for the storage account container is quite long because it's a name for the storage account, so as previously, unique string, and this is pretty much the same as here. Notice that we're supplying it here, here, and here. / default / the name of the container, and I'm adding a copy index. So in my case, I will create multiple containers called container 0, 1, 2, 3, etc, etc. But I'm passing an offset, so it's gonna start from 1. So container 1, 2, 3, etc, etc. And of course, I'm creating a copy loop here called copy containers. This is always used within the copy index as a parameter. And the dependency. And again, we need to create dependency here because you are dependent on the main storage account in order to create a container within that storage account. This is quite long example, that's why I didn't type it from scratch, but we can go to the portal and create that deployment very quickly. So let's paste it in again. Create arm05 and let's create 7 and hit purchase. When the storage account appears, go into it, open containers section to find yourself 7 containers starting from 1 because we passed that offset starting at 1. This is how easily you can deploy the child resources. Remember that child resource needs to also be a top level resource, so it needs to be within that main resource section. It cannot be part here as a resources section within your storage account. So it wouldn't work if you would do it here. You need to do it as a top level resource when you want to use the copy iterations. Alright, so for the next example, before we move to the next example, maybe let's clean it up because I want to show you one of the good practices. If you're going to be referencing a lot of times the same name that you're combining like that, my advice is to use a variable to do that. So for instance, you can create a variable called storage name and pass the same concatenation like here, storage unique string, so that later in the template you simply refer to it. Instead of the concatenation, you type variables and use the storage name. As you see, this is much more readable when it comes to using that variable from the template because it's also differently coded. And you can use the same here. Instead of that long sentence, type variables, storage name. Right, we missed concat. So concatenate, and it's very easy to notice now that you're concatenating the name of the storage account that is the same across the entire template, container name, and the end the copy index. And lastly, we should also do the same here. So maybe just copy this and grab there instead of resource ID, instead of this long string, just grab the name here. And that's much more readable. So that's just a good practice, to be honest. This is especially important because in copy loops, you're going to be referring to those dynamically generated names quite often. So make sure to apply this. So what's the next example for us? In the next example, I want to show you how to create a property, but in this case, how to create a dynamic variable. In this case, maybe let's use the same example. Let's use the example where we create a list of the names for those containers. Because as you see, this again is quite long. So we can create then property, actually variable, called containers. And normally you would create it like that, container names, right? And then provide values. If this would be an array, you would provide array with values. But in this case, you want to create a block using the copy element. So you specify copy, an array. Within an array, it's an object. It's just a notation, remember about it, and provide a name. And in this case, it's gonna be container names. It's just, this will be replaced later on here, right? So it's just gonna be a variable with container names as a name. You need to provide a count. So remember the count is here, so we can just copy paste that. Count. So it's the same. And the third one, as we remember in the presentation, it copies the inner block from the input property. So you need to provide the input. In this case, the input is this long expression here. So let's grab this and paste it here. This will create the container names array with the name of our containers. This is again a good approach if we're gonna reuse these container names across your template. Now that we have this, we can actually go here. So we need to supply into this loop here. So what we're doing, instead of passing the parameter count, we can use a already generated variable. So in this case, it's no longer parameter, it's variable. Let's actually remove this. And the name of the variable is container names. But since this is an array, you need to pass the length. So how long is our array? How many elements does it have? So we're gonna iterate over our generated names right now. And we just need to use those names in here. So this will be variables, container names, and then the current iteration is the copy index. And good practice again, just pass the name of the loop. If this works, we can actually go into the portal and perform another deployment. Let's hit create, build from the editor, paste it here, save it, arm06, let's type 6, I agree and hit purchase. We've got some error, copy index, and I know what I did. Because when we copied this element, we didn't change the copy index here, because it's still referring to that loop over there. So just grab this container name and iterate over that. So let's grab this and again replace that in the portal. Let's hit save, scroll down, I agree and hit purchase. Again, important practice to always check what you're doing within your template. Once the deployment is done, you can go to storage account, check containers, and everything works as expected. This is how you can actually create variables using the copy element and create dynamically named variables and arrays with the properties of your choosing, and then iterate those variables within your ARM templates. Notice how shorter our template is right now in this section, how much more readable this is. It's very good for debugging purposes as well. For the next demo, I'm gonna list the keys for the storage accounts that I create. So I'm gonna create a loop, storage loop. Again, I'm gonna create 3 storage accounts, and I'm gonna use output section. Notice in this section, I'm gonna call it storage endpoints. It's gonna be type of an array. There's gonna be a copy element. This element is an object. It only specifies the count, in which case we're counting how many storage did we create. And for each, we're creating a reference. We're creating a concatenation of the name, so this is the same as here, with the same unique index, giving the same offset, remember, because the name needs to match, and returning the primary endpoints for the blob container. So this will return the URLs for our newly created storage accounts. And you can quickly grab this template, go to the portal, hit create, again, our own template, new ARM07, resource group, create 5, agree and hit purchase. As you see, the 5 storage accounts were created, and if you go to deployment section, to your template, to the outputs, you're gonna find a list of the endpoints for the blob storage of your 5 storage accounts. This is how nicely you can automate your outputs of your templates with those copy blocks. This is a very good practice if you're using Azure DevOps, because you can pass the output parameters into Azure DevOps to do some additional deployment steps. So let's go to the template and perform very last demo. This demo is very advanced, so I'm just gonna browse through it. What we're doing here is we're passing 3 parameters, plan name, web app name. So we're deploying a web app. We're passing the storage account, so we're gonna also deploy 3 storage accounts like previously. And what we're gonna do here is, First of all, good practice, we're gonna calculate the dynamic names for the plan name and the web app name. We're gonna create the storage accounts. We're gonna iterate over them as many times as the parameters. So in default case, that's gonna be 3 storage accounts, iterating over this loop, starting at number 1. And after we deploy that, we're gonna create a dependency. Notice depends on. So our website will wait for both web server farm to finish, and it will also wait for our storage account deployments to finish, because it is dependent on both of them. After this, we're gonna deploy Azure website, and we're gonna fill a section called properties site config, create a copy element over properties called app settings, and notice that we're gonna create storage account keys with a number pointing to the storage account keys of the newly created storage accounts. So let me show you actually what this actually does rather than talk over the template. So let me create that. Let's perform deployment. ARM08. Hit create. Let's create 3 storage accounts, maybe 4 in this demo. I agree and hit purchase and just wait. And as you see, the template deployment finished. We created 4 storage accounts, web application, but what our copy loop did is you go to app service, go to the configuration section, you will find that we supplied application settings dynamically from those 4 storage accounts. We created access keys to each one of them dynamically by using template iterations and this copy loop here. It's a quite long expression, but you get the idea. It's just the gist of idea for you of what you can achieve using ARM templates and copy iterations. As you see, you can create quite a lot of resources using this method. Using this copy block, you can create multiple, even hundreds of resources at the same time, or fill multiple properties from those resources in a simple manner. That's it for today. If you liked the video, hit thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe if you want to see more, and definitely see you next time.